Welcome to the session on the object data source. Our objectives for this session are as follows. Number 1. Understanding the object data source. 2. Using parameterized commands with the object data source. 3. Handling extra option in list controls using the object data source. The object data source is similar to the SQL data source, but the data access is performed by code that we will be writing. In this example here for the object data source, we have an object data source defined with the ID data source student. It has a select method called getStudents, update method called updateStudent, delete method called deleteStudent, and an insert method called insertStudent. The type name is given by StudentDB. So StudentDB is a class which is the data access class and has the following methods: getStudents, updateStudent, deleteStudent, and insertStudent. And the data object type name, which is student, is what is passed to the different methods. This is the simplest definition of an object data source. An object data source is actually a data access class which conforms to the following rules. Number 1, the data access class must be stateless. That is, it should not have instance variable. Each method should be self-contained and they should not be sharing values within the same class. There need to be at least one no argument default constructor. All the data access methods must belong to the same class. For example, in the definition we saw previously, the get students, the update student, the delete student, insert student, all these methods must be defined within the StudentDB class. So it should be all contained in one class. If the data access class returns query results that are more than one, then it can return a collection such as an array or a list object. Each record returned by the data access method must be a custom object, and all the data of the custom object must be accessible through public properties. In our examples, the student class is the data object type name. It has ID, name, admission number, and course as private attributes, and ID with a capital I, name with a capital N, course with a capital C, and admission number with a capital A are the public properties. Next, our data access class is called StudentDB, and it has the methods getStudents, getStudent by name, insertStudent, updateStudent, deleteStudent, etc. The insert, update, and delete student take a parameter of type student, which is the data object type name which we saw previously. The getStudents method returns more than one student, and hence the return type is a list of students. And note, we have a default no argument default constructor here. The type name example is StudentDB, which is the data access class, and the data object type name is called student, which is the method as returned from the data access methods. The getStudents method will return a list of students and is a select method for the query. Once we have defined the object data source, we can use it in data binding like how we do it with the SQL data source. For example, we have defined an object data source here, and then this object data source with the ID data source student can be the data source for the grid. Everything on the grid definition is the same as what we have seen in the SQL data source. The only change is the type of the data source. Here we have an object data source where previously it was a SQL data source. Other than that, there is no change on the grid view definitions. Time for us to look at a sample web application that uses the object data source. Please download the source code from the portal as a zip archive and extract it to a local folder. Now, using Visual Web Developer, File menu, Open Website, specify the top level folder to where you have extracted the downloaded source archive. Select default.aspx on the Solutions Explorer and click the Run button. there are some assumptions we have made here. There is a local DB called studentDB and has a table called student. And this table called student has some columns, ID, name and admission number. So let me bring up Visual Web Developer, and from the file menu I'm going to say open website and point it to my top level folder which contains the source I downloaded from the portal and extracted to a local folder. Now I'm going to select default.aspx and do a run. This has loaded the website in my default web browser. So we have 4 records in the database right now, which are shown in the grid. Okay, notice the data source for this grid is an object data source, and when I do a select on one particular record, that is selected in the details view. We have a read-only view and a view wherein we can edit the records. Then we have a drop-down list which is pre-filled with the names of the students from the database, and selecting a particular student changes the details view. Thus we have a master details relationship here, and we have one more extra drop-down list which is similar to the drop-down list above. The student names are pre-filled here as well, but we have 2 extra options here: select student and select all students. When I click on select student, nothing happens. When I click on all students, all the students of the database are displayed in the grid view. So let us see how this has been done in our code. Let us open up default.aspx and look at the object data source definition. We have an object data source called data source student, which has a select method called getStudents, an update method called updateStudent, a delete method called deleteStudent, and an insert method called insertStudent. Then there is a type name called studentDB, which is the data access class, and the data object type name is called student. The data object type name is the class that is passed between the methods, either as a parameter or as a return value. And studentDB is the name of the data access class where all these methods are defined. So let us look at studentDB and student.cs. StudentDB and student.cs are plain C# class files. How do you define these files? Is select the top level folder on your Solution Explorer, right click and say add new item. Select the particular item you want to add. In this case it is a class file. Okay, and then just add the class file. When I say add, Visual Web Developer prompts me saying that you are attempting to add a special file to an ASP.web application. In general, we need to add this to the app_code folder. Do you want to place the file in the app_code folder? If I say yes, this class testdb.cs gets placed in the app_code folder. This way in your website, all the code files are maintained for you under one particular folder. So let us look at studentdb.cs. We added studentdb.cs in a similar manner. Okay, so first and foremost is our default no argument constructor. We have a connection string reference here, which refers to the connection string from the web.config file. The getStudent method creates a SQL string and opens a connection to the database and executes the reader with the SQL command select ID, name, admission number from student. Once we execute the command and get the reader, we loop through each record, create a new student and add the student to the students list, and finally return the list of students. List of students is defined in the very beginning. So we create a SQL connection, create a command, execute the command, get the SQL data reader, create new objects for each row, add them to list of students, and return the list finally in the method called getStudents. Similarly, we have a method called getStudent by name. What we do is we create a SQL string with a where clause, the name equal to @name, and we pass in the name here to this method. We execute the command, get the SQL data reader, create a new object called student, and finally return the student back. In the insert student method, what we do is we pass in a student value here, create a SQL string, insert into student name, admission number, and course, and get the values from the passed in object. From the student we get the name, from the student we get the admission number and the course. Use these values in the SQL string. Once we have formed the SQL string, we create a SQL command, open the connection, and do a execute non-query. This has the effect of creating a record in the student table. Similarly, for the update student, we do the same thing. The student information is passed into the method. We get the name, admission number, course, and ID from the student object, form a SQL string, open a new connection to the database, and execute the command. We use execute non-query for all the insert, update, and delete statements. This way, the data gets updated in the database for whatever student ID we are passing in. Similarly, for delete student, we again pass in a student object. We get the ID from the student object, form a SQL string, delete from student by ID equal to the passed in student's ID, create a SQL command, open a connection, and do an execute non-query. This will delete the record from the database. This is a data access class, and our data object type name is the student.cs. We have private attributes and public properties. Name, course, admission number are all public properties. So let us go and look at the markup definitions. So we define an object data source with the ID as data source student, and then we have another object data source called data source student details. The select method here is getStudent, and the select method for the previous one is getStudents. GetStudent method on the data access class studentDB is as follows. GetStudent is here, and it requires a ID, int ID as the parameter value. So what we do here is, in our definition on the markup, we specify the select method as getStudent, and now this method getStudent needs an ID to be passed in. This ID will come from a select parameter. We have a query string which is supply the ID. So this is how we define the object data source, where the select parameters comes from a query string. Okay, let us look at how we use this in action. We have defined two object data sources, one with the select method called getStudents, and the other with the select method called getStudent. And getStudent requires an ID to be passed in. So this is the main grid view which uses data source student. The select method is getStudents, which is the plural, which will return a list of students. And when the select button is clicked, on select index changing, we have an event handler called select index changing. And then we define the columns, the data field as the column name, and then we have a header text which can be a customized text. This way we have flexibility to change the header text from being different from that in the database column name. So we have defined a grid view which uses the data source student. The data source student is an object data source, and the select method is get students, plural, get students, which is the plural, right? This will show all the students in the database in the grid view. Okay, now we have another details view called read only view, and the data source ID for it is the data source student details. Then we have another details view which also uses the same data source student details. The data source student details has a select method called get student, and for this student we require an input parameter called ID of type int which needs to be passed in. Get student method on studentdb.cs requires an ID to be passed in. So what we do here is, on the markup for the grid view we have the on select index changing event. Let us look at the event handling for this on selected index changing. Open default.aspx.cs, and on the select index changing method what we do is we get the selected grid view row, we get the student ID using the cells of 1. The first column is the ID column, so we get the student ID. We form a URL with a query string ID equal to the passed in student ID. So whatever record gets selected, that particular selected record's ID is what is in the URL. So we would have default.aspx ID equal to 1 if Harry is clicked, default.aspx ID equal to 2 if Ron is clicked, and default.aspx ID equal to 3 if Hermione is clicked. And once we form the URL, we do a response.redirect. So this in effect reloads the page. So when the page is reloaded, this particular data source, the data source student details, has the query string parameter ID. It uses this ID and passes it to the getStudent method to select the student to show in the details view. That is how when I run this program, when I click on Harry is shown in the read-only view and the second details view, and changing the selection changes the element in the details view, master details view, using select parameters. Now this master details view can also be from another control. Like in this example, we select Ron, we show the data for Ron. We select Hermione, we show the data for Hermione. So this way we have a master details view. In this case we have not used the query string, but we use the control parameters. What we have, let's look at the definition of how we have done this. We have a source students names which calls get students. So get students will get all the students from the database. This is the data source for the drop down list. And then we have an object data source called source students from name, and the select method is get student by name. Get student by name requires an input parameter of type string to be passed in. Now this parameter will be passed from the control called DDL names. So whenever a value is selected from the drop down list, that selected value, which is the name, is passed to the get student by name method, and that gives us the data which is shown in the grid view, which as we saw here. select Ron, only Ron's data is shown. So the difference between this select parameter, wherein we use a control parameter with a control ID, and in this example we use the query string. And the select parameter for a data source can be a query string or it could be another control as well. Finally, in the example here, we saw the names of the students pre-filled for us. Let us say we want to add extra options to this list control. We want to add two more options. One which says select a student, which is a guideline for the user, or another item which says select all students. If all students are selected, I want to see all the students instead of seeing one by one. So I want to have something like this: select student and all students. These are not from the database. These are extra options in the control. So how do we do this, and how do we change the behavior when each of them is clicked? Let us look at it in action. First and foremost, we need to define a drop-down list. And this drop-down list, the data text field, we specify as name. We have not specified the data source for this drop-down list. Okay. Then for the grid view, we need to have a data source. We call it the source students from name 2, so that it is unique and different from what we have defined already. Remember, the data source ID for the object data source as well as the SQL data source, the ID need to be unique across the page. So that is why we have chosen the ID as source students from name 2. Here the control parameter is the DDL names extra drop-down list. So we have defined a drop-down list, and then we have created an object data source where the select parameter is provided by the drop-down list selected value. And we have defined a grid view which uses the new object data source whose select parameter is controlled by DDL names extra. DDL names extra is going to be a drop-down list which is going to have extra options. So to recap, we created a drop-down list, we created an object data source for the grid, and then we define the grid itself. Note that in the object data source of the grid, we added the select parameter to be the control DDL names extras selected value. Now let us look behind the code. Let us look behind the scenes and see how this is accomplished. Now let us see how we handle the extra options. First and foremost, we need to add the extra options. So on the page load event, if it's not a post back, we first specify the data source for the DDL names extra drop-down list, which is source student names. Source student names will get all the students from the database. So we'll have Harry, Ron, Hermione and myself as the students, and then we do data bind. So what this does is it fills the data source. So what this does is it fills the drop-down list with the names of the students from the database. Next, we add two new items called select student and another item called all students. When select student is selected, that selected value will be -1. When all students is selected, the selected value will be -2. And then we insert them one below the other, and then we make the top one as selected. If you look at the definition of the object data source, there is an attribute on selecting which has a given event handler. So whenever a selection happens on the data source, we do some extra processing. What we do here is we get the input parameter name. If the input parameter name is null, we do nothing. Whenever a selecting event happens on the grid, we check the input parameter name. So on the grid, on the object data source, we specify on selecting, we have a special event handling. So on the object data source, we have an attribute on selecting which defines a event handling. Let us look at this event handling code. In this particular event handling code, we check the input parameter. If the input parameter name is null, we do nothing. If the input parameter name is -1, meaning select student has been selected, then again we cancel the operation. If all students has been selected, which is -2 is the selected value, we change the select method from getStudent by name to getStudents, thereby getting all the students from the database. So this way we control the actual select method from within the code. And this is how we handle extra options using object data sources. You select all students, you get to see all the students here. You select a single student, you just see that student data here. If you select the very first one, which is the guideline for the user, you get to see nothing. So let us go back to our slides. The way we use parameters commands in object data source is similar to how we use it in SQL data source. For example, we have an object data source called source student names and another object data source called source students from name. Source students from name uses the select method getStudent by name. GetStudent by name requires a name as an input parameter. This name, which is required as an input parameter, is supplied with a control called DDL names. This way, we have a master details relationship. So, drop-down list DDL names has source student names. Source student names will fetch all the names from the student table in the studentDB database. And the grid has the data source ID as source students from name. So whenever a change happens on the drop-down list, it affects the data source students from name, and that is how the data is changed in the details. The drop-down list DDL names is the master and the grid view 2 is the details. Updating records using object data source is straightforward. We specify an update method, and similarly we do the same for delete or insert method. And if you look at the definition of the grid view while using the object data source, it is the same as what we did for the SQL data source. There is no change on the grid view definitions. The update method, delete method and insert method need to be methods on the studentDB class, and they should either accept a student object or return a student object. How to handle extra options in the object data source? First, we define the data source of the list, source student names. The select method is getStudents. So this will get all the students on the DB. Then we define the drop-down list called DDL names. We have not specified the data source for the DDL names yet. Then we define a object data source. The object data source has a select method getStudent by name. GetStudent by name requires a name parameter to be passed to this method. That input parameter will come from the control called DDL names. Since we specify the select parameter control ID as DDL names. Next, we define the grid, which uses the source student from name as the data source. Now, in the page load event, first we add the data source for the DDL names drop-down list, and then you do a data bind. So what will happen here is all the student data from the database will be fetched, and the name will be populated in the DDL names drop-down list. Next, we create two new items, an item called select student and an item called all students. The value for the select student is -1 and the value for the all students will be -2. These two items are added to the list, one below the other, and the topmost one select student is selected. Then we have the onSelecting event handler. What it does is it looks at the parameter name. If the input parameter name is null, it cancels the operation. If the input parameter name value is -1, which is select student, again the operation is cancelled. If the selected value is select all students, what we do is we change the select method from whatever was given to getStudents method. This way, all student data is returned from the database. So here's what we have seen so far. We have seen how to define the object data source and use it in data binding. We have used parameters commands and master details views. We have seen how to update data using object data source, and we also seen how to handle extra options in list controls using the object data source. So this brings us to the end of the data bound controls, the SQL data source and object data source. Please take your time to go through the lesson and understand how things have been defined. I hope you enjoy these lessons, and we will see you soon.